Aloha, everyone. Mahalo for being here, and I'm honored to be part of this event. Now, for this talk, I will be going through various examples of misinformation and the empirical research regarding the psychological drivers and inoculators of misinformation. Now, one may think that the answer to issues regarding misinformation is simply common sense or logic. But hopefully by the end of this talk, I'm going to show you that the complexity of the situation involves a more nuanced approach that should really consider the psychology of how we process information. So first, we're going to start with the scenario. As a social psychologist, I like to start with a lot of scenarios. So imagine you're on a social media site. It could be something like Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or something now that I don't know about, but is really common and popular. And you're part of it, you're a moderator, and you see a post that gets posted in the room that you're moderating. And it's from an elected official or elected politician who is self-declared as a Democrat. This person has more than 1 million followers. And this person publishes a series of posts about Holocaust denial, consistently over and over again. You know this is blatantly false information. It's completely false. It's misinformation. Now, this is not the first time this person has posted this, so it's kind of becoming a pattern at this point. These posts, you also know, tend to have a serious side effect that is estimated to possibly impact about 1 million people who will likely join a white supremacist organization and, as you know, inadvertently promote violence against local Jewish communities. And you've seen this as a moderator. What do you do in this situation? So what I'm going to propose, I'm going to have a poll for you here. And let me actually relaunch this poll. Yeah, let's do that. And you can put in here what you would do. Would you remove the post that the person posted, or would you do nothing at this point? And we won't look at the results right away. I'm just asking, hey, what would you do at this point as a moderator? Would you remove the post or just kind of sit back and do nothing at this point? We had a few people responding, still a little few. We're not going to view the results right away. I'm going to view them at the end. So feel free to kind of put in what you initially feel. Would you remove the post as a moderator for the website, knowing all of these different things that are right here? So we have about half of the people have responded. I'm going to give it a couple of seconds more. Oh yeah, a few more people have gotten it. A few more. And yes. Okay, we've gotten all the results in. I'm not going to show you the results. I'm just going to end the poll here and we're going to look at the results later. I do also want to ask you another question. Now, I asked you just about the posts in general. I also want to ask you about, given that scenario, what would you do to the person's account? Remember, you're the moderator in this situation. So you have quite a bit of things that you can do as a moderator. Would you indefinitely suspend the account? Would you temporarily suspend the account? Would you issue a warning, or would you do nothing? Yeah. Again, I'm not going to show you the results until the very end. I want you to kind of think about things first a little bit. Just for now, just provide your initial reaction. What would you do at this point? Yeah, you could indefinitely suspend, temporarily suspend, issue a warning, or just do nothing. Okay, about half of people have responded. Awesome. Just waiting for a few more to come in. Awesome. Great. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. And then we're going to get back to this because this is something that I really do want everyone to kind of think about as we talk more and more about misinformation in general. Okay, so first, what is misinformation? Now, misinformation is any information that was later discovered to be false. Misinformation has been around since people were able to communicate and spread information. Roman coinage, for example, was not just used as a form of currency, but also as a way to display slogans and propaganda, sometimes bending the truth very effectively because of its spread. And when the printing press and newspapers came about, more complicated misinformation could be spread. We can kind of consider Roman coinage to be like the first tweet that kind of got out there. And then we can kind of consider when the printing press came out, there's more complicated misinformation. Like you can see here with the Great Moon Hoax, which was published in the Sun in 1835, excuse me, which discovered life on the moon. And every time I see the image, I'm just like, that'd be so cool if that's what we really found on the moon. But this really did help perpetuate more of this kind, oh, is there life on the moon? And of course, it really did sell quite a bit of the Sun tabloid. Now, today, with ever advancing digital infrastructure and alternative information channels, misinformation campaigns can quickly expand their reach. Using, for example, social media, free self-advancing platforms, people can both intentionally and unintentionally spread misinformation to a wide audience in a matter of minutes. Use of online profiles to and current algorithms allows information to be specifically curated to ensure a person's previous searches and biases can be continually reconfirmed with more recent media stories. So you're getting the same stories, just newer in newer ways. The latest advancement in AI, some of you might have heard of ChatGPT, that generative pre-trained transformer, can also inadvertently accelerate the spread of misinformation as more people use, or actually more accurately misuse it as like a kind of search engine, as opposed to a generative language model, which can be very useful in different types of contexts and different ways of applying language. Now, given these advancements, what is the impact of misinformation? So spreading misinformation can have a significant impact on the welfare of our community and significant personal consequences. For example, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was such an incredible spread of both accurate and inaccurate information that many have deemed it an infodemic. Now, it has been found that this infodemic significantly impacted vaccination rates, mask adherence, and conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus. And other types of misinformation spread. Some may remember, for example, Pizzagate. So in the Pizzagate incident, it resulted in a North Carolina man driving all the way up to Washington, D.C., a pizza parlor there, comment, with his gun and threatening workers at the pizza parlor because he read misinformation online about this pizza parlor hiding a child prostitution ring in its basement. To be clear, it doesn't, and it doesn't have a basement even. So just to be very clear on that, but that kind of spread of misinformation can have significant impact on people's lives. The Pew Research Center has found that the majority of Americans find misinformation to be a significant issue. And this trend continues. So this poll was actually done in 2016, but they did this poll more recently, and you'll see the same kind of majority trend of Americans feeling, hey, it has a significant impact on our lives. Now, misinformation can definitely have, oh, let me pull back on that. Misinformation can definitely have a significant impact on people's daily lives. But misinformation is so pernicious that even when misinformation is not present, the mere suspicion of misinformation can be just as powerful. For example, was a study I wanted to show you. One study found that even when the impact of misinformation is not there or just negligible, the very suspicion of it will actually negatively impact people's views of democracy, of media, and of government. What's interesting about this image here from the study from Jane Nisbet and colleagues, excuse me, is that you can see on the x-axis those who are low or average or high in terms of how they're paying attention to political and election news. And then on the y-axis, you see how much of they think in terms of perceived influence of misinformation. The higher people are consuming more information and the higher they think they have presumed influence of misinformation, the less trust they tend to have, especially in terms of government and politics in general and in media. This effect you'll see especially true for Democrats and independents as well. Now, all these examples suggest that both misinformation and the presumed influence of misinformation are powerful enough to impact health behavior, social outcomes, and attitudes about one's government and society. So now I want to ask another poll, and this time I will show you the results about this. How about you? What do you think? So I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think misinformation has created no confusion, some confusion, or a great deal of confusion in the United States? So I'm going to launch this poll right now. What do you think in terms of misinformation? A great deal, some confusion, no confusion at all. All right, where are we at? How do you feel right now in terms of that regard? Okay, a majority of people have responded. Just waiting for oh, we got it. Everyone has responded to this. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to show you the results here, and you can see the majority of you definitely think, yes, there's a great deal of confusion that's being caused by misinformation in the United States. Okay, so I want to ask you another question. Now I'm going to stop sharing that one, and let me go back to the next poll here. Are you, just thinking about yourself, are you more, less, or about average in succumbing to misinformation? Or another way to put it, when it comes to falling for or being impacted by misinformation, are you about above average, below average, or just average in your likelihood to succumb to that? Average, below average, above average, and succumbing to misinformation. Oh, got a variety of results. Oh, yes. Oh, very exciting. Just okay. Okay, got waiting for one more there we go. There we go. Here we go. So I'm going to end the poll. Excellent. And I'm going to share results for you all now. So when it comes to falling for, I can see a good majority is actually kind of below average. So not it's less, all right, in terms of likely to succumb to that kind of misinformation, as opposed to being, for example, about or more likely above average in that regards. And there's some people that say, oh, I'm just about average. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that one, and I'm going to go back. Now, I think most of us have some belief that misinformation is an issue, especially given what one may see on social media. The very example I gave at the beginning of this talk, we have often probably come across misinformation on social media. Also, it isn't uncommon to believe that one is less likely to succumb to misinformation. Most might think that succumbing to misinformation is kind of foolish, and most don't want to be thought of as a fool. I know I don't. Nevertheless, we are all human and we do have some limited capabilities. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the distinctions and approaches when it comes to facing misinformation. Now may also be a good time to make a distinction between misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is an umbrella term that can cover disinformation as well. But when a distinction is made between misinformation and disinformation, it's really in reference to its intentionality. So misinformation is false information that's spread unintentionally. It's often like, oh, I didn't realize that was wrong. Oh, it's misinformation. Well, disinformation is misinformation spread intentionally, often for the purposes of profit, creating a following, changing a specific outcome, or sometimes just for laughs, or I think it's lulz might be the term, or trolling. All of those things are there for that intention for disinformation. Now, for the purpose of this talk, and since I'm covering more about the consumption of information than the spread of it, I'm going to refer broadly to misinformation to also cover disinformation. Now, whether misinformation is intentionally or unintentionally spread, many have typically tackled the issue of misinformation with two approaches. The first is typically by increasing the access to and spreading of factual information. So true, real information and correct information. And then also through a way of retracting misinformation once it is caught. Now, the first approach is really intended to push out that misinformation by saturating and increasing accessibility to factual information. This is also an approach that really is approaching the issue logically. One may find themselves, for example, maybe you found yourself in this situation when you have a friend or a family member who might strongly adhere to a kind of misinformation. And your initial reaction may be something like this, where, oh, you know, if they just had the facts, they would know better. They would just understand. Now, we will discuss how that can sometimes be useful, but it can also times be not as effective as we would hope it to be. Now, the second approach is intended to remove misinformation and help debunk false information once it is there. Now, in academia, we're often used to retracted papers that often get published and then later pulled by, like, for example, a journal because they've discovered later on some inconsistencies or falsehoods or unethical things in the paper. Now, we can often encounter retractions too in magazines or newspapers. You might have seen that where they go, oh, we updated this, we actually had this wrong. But retraction can have its issues too, just because of the way our mind and memory works. Now, both these approaches suggest that people are primarily logical and that a thorough and accessible explanation of facts should overcome any negative impact of misinformation. However, this kind of information deficit model that is being based on, oh, these will solve this misinformation issue, ignores some of the foundational aspects of psychology, specifically that the creation of attitudes and judgments about information are rarely done through cold logical approaches. People tend to have cognitive biases, social pressures, and emotional investments that go into the consumption of information. For example, some individuals contend that the world is flat. They deny climate change and or reject vaccinations despite being aware of a scientific consensus to the contrary. This rejection of science is not just some form of ignorance. It's also driven by psychological factors that I want to discuss now about how a lot of these types of psychological factors can promote misinformation. So the major psychological drivers of misinformation that I'm going to discuss today are the following. There are others too, but I just want to cover for this talk these 5. So first is the third person effect, and I'll give you some examples of that too. Then we'll also cover confirmation bias, which many of you have probably heard already. Then I'll also talk about how we tend to be cognitive misers. I'll also talk about emotions. And then finally, I'll talk about identity, adherence, and expression. And I'll provide examples for each of these and how we can become more aware of these issues in ourselves and others as well. So many of you may feel that you are less likely to succumb to misinformation or that misinformation affects others more than you, but you're not alone in that type of thinking. This effect is so strong it has a name. It's the third person effect. And it's the tendency to think others are just more likely to fall prey to the effects of misinformation. The roots of the third person effect has to do with perception, specifically a self-other difference, seeing oneself as more capable or seeing others as less able to detect or more vulnerable to the pernicious effects of misinformation. Now, several studies have found that people with higher levels of the third person effect are more likely to overestimate the impact of socially undesirable things like gambling or alcohol or pornography. They are also more likely to want to censor information in general. Finally, others have shown that TPE or the third person effect is stronger for those that we perceive as out-group members. Specifically in Jang and Kim's study, they found that Republicans and Democrats were more likely to think that the other group, the out group, so like for Republicans, that would be Democrats, for Democrats, that would be Republicans, they think that group is more susceptible to misinformation than their own group and themselves. Now, the problem with this effect is that it underestimates one's own vulnerability to misinformation and overestimates others' vulnerability to misinformation. And when one is too confident, one may be less able to spot the misinformation when it is actually there. Okay, now the next psychological driver I want to talk about is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to only pay attention to and process information that already confirms information or beliefs one has. It's also the tendency to ignore information that can counter our own beliefs. For example, let's imagine that a person holds a belief that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people. Now, whenever this person encounters a person that is both like left-handed and creative, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, I want to place a lot of importance on this evidence because look, look, it verifies my hypothesis. See, left-handed people are more creative, right? Because it already supports an existing belief. However, when they encounter somebody who's right-handed and creative, they'll just sort of go, oh, that's the exception, or ignore that aspect of data that disconfirms their belief. The individual will probably seek more proof for that further backs up their belief while discounting those other examples that shows no. Like if they meet a left-handed person that's not creative, they're going to be like, oh, that's again an exception. Now, confirmation biases impact how people gather information. It also influences how they interpret and recall that information. For example, people who support or oppose a particular issue will not only seek information that supports their beliefs, they will also interpret new news sources and stories in a way that actually upholds their existing ideas and remember things that only tend to reinforce those attitudes. A number of experiments in the 1960s for social psychologists demonstrate that people have a tendency to seek information that already confirms their beliefs. Unfortunately, this type of bias can prevent us from looking at situations objectively and can influence the decisions we do make that can also lead to poor or faulty choices. So confirmation bias can impact both our searching for and processing of information. Now, confirmation bias can come into play when we actually have time and energy to search for and think about information, but some psychological drivers of information actually are reflected by kind of a lack of thinking. So I want to talk about being cognitive misers. Okay, so what is a cognitive miser? Well, I'm going to first, first let me say this. Given that many of us are in education and academia, we can often pride ourselves in our joy of learning, thinking. That being said, we might not always have the time or the energy to engage in deep thought or be that thoughtful. So let me give you an example of a question here. And I just want you can put it in the chat too, to give your first initial reaction or your response. So your first initial answer just right away. So here's the question. If you're running a race and you pass the person in second place, what place are you in? Right, so you're in a race, you pass the person second place, what place are you in? Does anyone want to volunteer an answer? Yeah. Okay, good. Now, I don't know about you. Some people have answered. Awesome. Anyone else want to? You don't have to. Okay, good. Okay, all of you got it. Okay, you got it. Now, I don't know about you, but what happened? Yes, your first reaction. Okay, so your first reaction might have been, and you shouldn't feel bad about this, might have been, oh, first place, right? Your initial response, kind of like, past second, what's above second? It's first, right? Because that's what we're thinking right away. But then you have to go, oh, wait a minute. Like if they're second, oh, then that would, now I am second, right? And then it takes a moment though to think about it. And that type of thinking takes time. It takes energy. Exactly. And you're some of you are like, I didn't even know the race was happening. Okay, or over yet. Now, the intuition behind our initial thoughts can often lead us to overlook important details that could make us suspicious about the authority and authenticity of the information. And by overlooking it, because oftentimes we are cognitive misers, oftentimes we just don't have the energy or thought, we're just going on that kind of initial impression that we have, we can end up believing in something that we just kind of inadvertently heard and thinking it's true because we didn't take that extra time to go, wait, no, it's not second place, or it's not first place, it's second place. Now, thinking, or in this case, a lack thereof, can definitely also impact our perception and the authenticity of the information. But there's also that more that goes into misinformation, just our thoughts. So I covered here that third person effect, confirmation bias, and cognitive miserliness. I also want to talk about this important aspect too of emotion. Okay, for example, emotions are important. Both the emotion of the person consuming the information and the tone of the emotion of the message can impact the susceptibility of misinformation. Happy moods tend to make people more susceptible to misinformation, often because one is trying, when they're in that happy mood, to maintain that happy mood, right? When you're in a happy mood,
you probably aren't going, hey, how can you show that I'm wrong today? No one wants to feel wrong in that day. When one is happy, one wants to usually be and maintain happiness. And then when one encounters misinformation, when they are, for example, happy, right, it can often create discomfort, right? Or if they create information that disconfirms their misinformation, this can create dissonance. Like, for example, realizing that the earth might be round when one is a flat earth believer, this can create a lot of anxiety, a lot of dissonance. And when one is happy, one wants to maintain that joy. So they might just ignore what they had seen because it's like, oh, I want to maintain that happiness. So many people in happy moods will often try to avoid information that could debunk misinformation. Additionally, happy people in general tend to like to focus on larger abstract concepts as opposed to details. And details is what can often tell us if something is wrong or bad in terms of in terms of information. Now, then you may ask, I don't know if this is like maybe some of you might go, wait, if happy people are more likely to be susceptible to misinformation, are sad people less susceptible to misinformation? It turns out yes. So studies have shown in social psychology and also clinical psychology that those who tend to be sad or show depressive symptoms are actually a little less susceptible to misinformation. And it's often because those who are sad tend to pay more attention to details and are all already primed, and this might sound sad, to be disappointed. So oftentimes they can be more likely to look, and some might argue realism, that they're often looking for those things to show that kind of disappointment. So yeah, sadness can often lead in many ways to be less susceptible to misinformation. Additionally, the emotion expressed in the headline and article of information can also impact how we perceive the subject or topic before we even fully read it. In fact, I don't know if you've done this, maybe you know somebody who's done this, shared misinformation or information or an article just through the headline. When if and many of you probably done this where you after you've read something after looking at the headline, you're like, wait a minute, what does this have to do with the headline? You might even say to yourself, oh, this had nothing to do with the headline. But it took that extra thought and thinking to really know that. A lot of headlines really do pull people in, and negative ones especially pull people and get those clicks associated with it. And sometimes these headlines can spread misinformation in and of itself because a lot of people know, oh, they're not going to take that time or extra effort to really read it at that moment for a variety of reasons. It's not just because we're cognitive misers, sometimes it's also because we don't have time in many ways. Okay, so that's emotions. Another important factor in the susceptibility to misinformation is one's identity. A person's values and belief system are typically grounded in their social cultural identity. And any corrections attacking a person's values, their beliefs, or their worldview may be ineffective or backfire because these corrections can be experienced as a kind of attack on one's identity. This can create often discomfort, dissonance, anxiety, or anger. And then the conversation stops right at that moment, and the person will now focus more about their feelings and feeling attacked as opposed to what's the actual revised information they are receiving. For example, if a message is appraised as an identity threat, for example, if somebody is an anti-vaxxer and someone has proposed to them information that corrects that kind of anti-vaxxer view or threatens their anti-vaxxer view, then instead of thinking about the message and the information, they're going to instead focus on the intense negative feelings of feeling threatened because they have adherence to their identity. They have loyalty to their group. So when that message is attacking that identity, they're not going to go, oh, of course, I need to think about this logically. Instead, they're going to want to react. And the reaction usually takes place in discrediting the source of the correction. So they go, oh, that's not right. That you're only following like the mainstream, or they'll discredit the source. Or they could ignore the details that are inconsistent with their worldview and only select things that seem to bolster their own worldview and identity adherence. That being said, presenting information that goes against one's worldview and identity should still be presented, but one should just be aware and think about how that information is framed. And I'll actually start talking now a little bit about how we can sort of protect ourselves and protect others regarding misinformation. And I'm really focusing on the psychological aspects. There are other speakers in the series for the week, especially Alfie Garcia, that's going to talk more about some of the other ways that you can look at information appropriately to assess its being factual and authority and adherence. But right now, I'm just going to talk about these kind of psychological inoculators. So how can we protect ourselves and others from our own psychological limitations and biases? I'm going to discuss two strategies of pre-bunking and debunking. So pre-bunking seeks to help people recognize and resist subsequently encountered misinformation, right? So it's before getting the misinformation. While debunking emphasizes responding to specific misinformation after the exposure to demonstrate why it is false. The effectiveness of these corrections is also influenced by a range of factors. So it's not like one is better than the other. And there's been some mixed results in efficacy. For example, some topics are better at being pre-bunked than debunked. I think anti-vaccination conspiracy theories are best approach with a pre-bunking versus a debunking approach, while other studies have found that debunking can often outperform pre-bunking when it comes to certain other topics as well. But it's good to know them both. Now, the simplest pre-bunking interventions tend to involve presenting factually correct information, a kind of preemptive correction or a generic information warning before the misinformation is spread. So in this little infographic from the study on pre-bunking here, you can see, oh, it's giving the person first fact-based, logic-based, source-based information about a topic, warning them of the risk that, hey, people do have different beliefs about this, and then actually being then exposed to the misinformation to provide a type of inoculation or immunity to it, so they realize, oh, it's a myth, and understand that these are certain tactics that are being used. Now, inoculation treatment can help people prepare for that subsequent misinformation exposure that can happen here. And treatment typically highlights the risks of being misled, alongside of like a good preemptive refutation. Going, how should you approach this when you do hear it? Now, the refutation is usually fact-based, but it can also be logic-based or source-based. And inoculation has been shown to increase misinformation detection and facilitate counter-arguing and dismissal of false claims. And inoculation can build immunity across topics so that one can increase their own likelihood of people talking about refutate, or when they encounter misinformation, other topics, recognize it right away and go, oh, they're using this tactic to help me kind of believe in this, or they're using this method of me believing in authority to do it in that way. Yeah, I apologize. In the example, we're using inoculation, and sometimes I mentioned anti-vaccination several times, but this is just the nomenclature that's being used. It's a good point, very good point. Okay, now in terms of pre-bunking, I kind of want to outline the kind of the steps that involves in this. The first element is really about warning the recipient of the threat of the misleading persuasion. It's getting a person to go, wait, you need to know that people are going to come at you with some false information out there, that it is there. The second element is identifying the techniques used to mislead, or some of the fallacies or examples of false arguments that are going to be there, and how we should know to refute that. For example, it could be like selective use of data, cherry picking. And if you know that, like for example, when it comes to climate change, you might go, oh, often those against that are only cherry picking certain years of the data and using that to completely make an argument about all of the data in general. Or using, for example, fake experts. Many people could have credentials, absolutely, but they're not actually experts in that area. Or so they'll say, oh yes, this is a scientist, or a self-proclaimed scientist, and saying, okay, this kind of authority is being used as a way to present the information, but it's actually misinformation in that way. Now what can we do? This is pre-bunking. Now, what can we do when we're already exposed to misinformation? Like, let's say you read for example, that Listerine can cure the common cold, which actually was a very common misinformation tidbit several years ago. In fact, I grew up in that era where I was really believing that Listerine could cure. We had Listerine in my house all the time because we really believed that it could cure the common cold. But we later found out, oh, that's not true. It doesn't. And several years, what would you do now? How would you overcome this misinformation regarding that? So we need to talk about debunking. And I'm going to talk about debunking in regards to both oneself and with others. Okay. Now, when it comes to debunking, you want to look for those facts and the factual information. Today is a lot easier to actually look up fact checking and sources than it used to be 30 years ago. 20, 30 years ago, if you heard a rumor, sometimes you believed it for years before somebody told you you might be wrong, or somebody told me that I might be wrong, because we just didn't have that kind of access to that information. Now that we have more access, try to look for that factual information and try, and this is often easier to say than to do, try to find information that might not necessarily align with your current beliefs. It's very difficult for most of us to try to prove ourselves wrong. But if you can find a way to make it a habit where you can go, oh, how might I be wrong in this situation? What might I have wrong? Then it can actually open up your mind to more perspectives and understand, oh, is something actually wrong? Maybe I don't have the right belief in this. Also, expect some error. And many believe that if something is written or said, or a certain authority said it, or somebody they really trust and love and respect says it, then it must be right. But we must be aware that mistakes happen. And in fact, to some extent, we should really be expecting it, especially with the advancement of technology. I talked at the beginning of this talk about social media. Technology allows anyone to write anything at any time and spread it anywhere very quickly. This means there's less moderation, there's less peer review, there's less editing, and therefore much more likely to see mistakes, errors, and biases. So you should expect to some extent not everything to be a crystal clear or truthful in every way. And also give yourself some time to think. When you encounter information for the first time, be aware that when we often read new information, you might have a thought or a feeling or intuition about it, and that leads you into a certain direction. But it is important to review why we are feeling that way and be aware of those feelings. It could be a kind of bias we have in the moment that we don't understand and go, oh, wait, I should have thought about that. It's because I was really tired in the moment, or oh, it was because I was doing something else. I didn't think about it. Give yourself some time to actually reflect on it. Now, when it comes to others, that's what recognize your feelings. When it comes to debunking things for others, usually you want to start kind of with these 5 steps here that I'm going to talk about, or actually 6. So first, you want to lead with a fact. For example, if you heard in the news a fire was thought to have been caused by negligence, then providing a causal alternative for why it wasn't actually caused by negligence. So if they're correcting it, say, oh, there's evidence for arson for this, as opposed to saying, there just wasn't any negligence. You want to give people now a substitute belief to have, as opposed to just say, we got it wrong. Well, what is the truth in that situation? So leading with a fact is typically better than just saying, oops, it just wasn't right in that situation. Also state the misinformation again, only to demonstrate that it was wrong. There has been many studies done that if you keep repeating misinformation, which I often hesitate to say certain things in certain talks, because if you say it enough, and even if you say it is misinformation, that kind of repetition can get people to think about it, and then they'll forget often that I've said, oh, that was misinformation, that was false, and they'll start really actually believing in it. So it's important to make note, you only want to repeat it once and just to make it very clear that it is misinformation. There's also emerging evidence that corrections are more impactful when they come from a socially connected source, or a source in which the person feels connected to. So if you want to correct a source, finding somebody who is similar to that person can often be more effective than if it's a stranger or someone that doesn't or someone that feels like they don't identify with that person. So if you can find someone that's more identifiable to that person, helping them present the factual information can be more effective. Also, demonstrate or presenting it correction with norms is helpful too. One study has found that a benefit to knowledge revision if the corrective evidence was also then endorsed by others on social media. Giving this impression that other people endorse this new correction as well can help lead people to go, oh, it seems like other people are recognizing this isn't correct either, so I should probably look into this. Also, using simple language and informative graphics can really facilitate knowledge revision, especially if fact comprehension might be otherwise difficult or compromised. Um, Often people don't want to really think too much into something or compound sentences to think about it. Also, if you can support a person's identity, but even with the corrective information, so it doesn't feel like a threat to their own identity and their own worldviews, the more effective that debunking will be. And I'll give an example here, actually. So here's one example of debunking. And let's say you might have a friend who really adheres to that climate denial, like climate change denial. They just, that's part of who they are. They don't really think it's an issue. In fact, if anything, they're like, well, you know, we should reap the earth the way as much as we possibly can. So that's part of their identity and worldview. So even though there's a lot of evidence, scientific evidence to suggest, oh, actually, this will damage the earth incredibly and it will hurt us and our outcomes, is presenting the information now in a way that's identity affirming and is consistent with their own worldview. So here on this example over here, if you want to help your friend with debunking of this, it is gray in the gray framed lines. This example here would help, okay, affirm their identity. So you know that they don't believe in climate change, but you know from their identity, oh, they really are more concerned about economics. So then you can say, okay, economic considerations are important. So you recognize the element of the person's identity when discussing the impacts of climate change. So you recognize that hey, economics matters. And then you also want to present the information factually with worldview consistent framing. So ignoring the expert consensus that human activities are causing global warming will actually have substantial negative impacts on the economy long term. And taking action on climate will reduce the economic risks and create many more business opportunities. Again, reframing the factual information to something that is rooted, is centered in the person's identity and consistent or consonant with their own worldviews. It's a great way to focus on debunking and providing that real information there. Okay, if there's any questions, let me know. Because now I want to go back to that scenario that we started off with. And if you remember at the beginning of this talk, we discussed what would you do if you encountered this type of misinformation online. Now, I discussed a lot of ways to arm oneself against misinformation, but I want to circle back to what I talked about in terms of the deficit information model. That's really about, hey, if we just present people with enough information and we retract, this will be helpful. Now, this kind of deficit information model is an ideal approach in many ways to dealing with misinformation. We should want, in many ways, to have more facts than lies when it comes to the consumption of information. And we should be able, right, to consider retraction and manage our expectations and confidence about the veracity of information accordingly. Because even by knowing the psychological drivers of misinformation and by even using the psychological inoculators I talked about to protect yourself and others, we would be in incredible danger if we lived in a society that encouraged the publication of lies over truth. And eventually, things wouldn't work or function, and many lives could actually be significantly impacted or worse, hurt and lost. However, this realization also brings up a very pure moral dilemma. Do we allow dangerous misinformation to spread, giving people the freedom to express whatever they want? Or should misinformation be removed or maybe penalized, thereby inadvertently limiting free speech? So remember, going back, to the scenario that you were provided. You are online, you find a post from an elected politician, who's a Democrat, they have more than 1 million views. They published a series of things about Holocaust denial. It's blatant misinformation. This isn't the first time they've done it, and it has serious consequences. Well, what I just presented to you was actually a replication of a study by Kosovera and colleagues in this year. And they found that in general, respondents were more reluctant to suspend accounts, for example, than to just remove posts. And they're more likely to do either if the harmful consequences of the misinformation were severe or if sharing it was a repeated offense. So let's actually look at some of your results and what you showed. So let's look at that first one. How many of you would remove the post? Now, a good majority of you said you would remove the post, which is aligned very well with the recent study that just came out this year. That, yeah, given the seriousness of this offense, removing it seems like many people would definitely do in this situation. So definitely aligned with what's already published out there. Now, how about the account? How would you treat this account? So let's look at the results here. And you can see it's a little spread. Some would indefinitely suspend, some would temporarily suspend. The majority of you said you would issue a warning. We go, hey, this is not appropriate. And some of you said you would do nothing. So there is that kind of spread there that we're seeing. And we can all see that we're also all not in agreement in this situation. I also want to talk a little more about their study because for most of you, as well as the participants in the study, content moderation of harmful information also tends to be a partisan issue. So in their study, they had various scenarios. And it tended to be that Democrats and independents were much more likely to want to remove posts than necessarily Republicans, whether or not whoever was stating it. And also, Democrats and Republicans were more likely to want to penalize certain accounts. Now, this study helps bring up a relevant concern. And a lot of it has to do with what we do in a world where we keep encountering misinformation, right? And when it comes to this kind of replication of findings, we've got to think about what would you do? Because these things aren't necessarily going to go away. Oh, you can't see the results? I'm so sorry. Let me see if I can show you that one again. Is it the second one here? Oh, thank you for mentioning that. Can you all see this one now? I'm sorry. Thanks for mentioning it in the chat. So you can see that the majority was all for issuing a warning versus indefinitely or temporarily suspend. All the temporary suspending was up there too. So we did replicate some of those findings there in that study too. Again, kind of demonstrating that, especially when it comes to serious offenses, people are more likely to want to step in that regard. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing. And I apologize if you weren't able to see some of that. Now, in real life, we rarely know the actual real consequences on social media platforms. So in this example, I actually told you what the consequences were. And in a study they did too, but in real life, you don't really know what the impact is. You'll often encounter misinformation and just kind of go, oh, that's not good, that's not right. And you kind of just imagine what the impact could be. And that can be put you in a dilemma again, because you don't really know what you should or can do. Now, until then, keep in mind what we can about some of these psychological drivers and inoculators, because we can't always control the flow of information, but we can control how we are consumers of that information and be critical in our consumption. So first, I'd like to thank you for this talk, and thank you for being here. I'd like to thank Karina, Albie, Soledad, all of the librarians at UH West Oahu. You're incredibly amazing. I also want to thank Whoopsie and Psykind. They're incredible psych student organizations here at UH West Oahu. Also my research group that helps me oftentimes with some of the research that's presenting here, and all of you for listening. Thank you so much. And I would love, mahalo, yeah, mahalo to you too. And I'd love to hear any questions you might have. Or comments too, and open it up to discussion. Yeah.
There was one question that came in that I'll pose to you, Katherine.
Oh yes.
And so it was really interesting to hear that sad people are slightly more likely to discern information. Can you expand a bit more on how sad was defined or determined in the study or multiple studies, if there were?
Yeah, so Forgas is the psychologist that likes to really focus on. I'll put his last name, Forgas, in there. If you can look it up on Google Scholar too, on the effect of depressive symptoms and sadness sort of impacting people's consumption of information. And it's been demonstrated kind of routinely that those who are sad, it's often because in the way they're defining it in the study is showing those kinds of depressive symptoms. And sometimes it's measured through PHQ-9. So just like, for example, endorsing sadness, feeling sad, not wanting to get out of bed, feeling melancholy, anhedonia, where things that did make you happy, you're not doing that anymore because you're kind of in a slump or sad. So a lot, and I can also give you some of the you can go back and give you some of the excuse me, the actual APA citations for it if you need. But a lot of that has to do when we're sad is looking at the details. So what can often make people lower their mood is they're not thinking fuller picture or longer term. They're often looking at exact details of a moment. And if you start picking at things in exact details, you'll start noticing more mistakes. That's just what happens when we start getting detail oriented. You'll notice that not everything is right. And this can have a great impact on one's mood. And then it kind of becomes a cycle where you keep seeing it and you notice it more and more. And that's why sometimes sad people are more likely in many ways to be less susceptible to misinformation because they'll be often noticing, oh, you're saying that person's a PhD, but they're really not. Or you're saying there's no, I can see that. That's not, because you're looking for and you're seeking kind of verifying your mood already, which is sad, and being disappointed and detailed in that way. Yeah. I'm not endorsing, by the way, that anyone becomes sad. So that shouldn't be your inoculator. Don't like be like, I'm just gonna be sad. Don't do that. But just is something that you should be aware of. It's just one of those psychological things. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. Another question that came in is about whether the third person effect is related to the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh, the Dunning-Kruger effect. I love the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the Dunning-Kruger effect, in case you haven't, yes, they are related to something. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is okay. So there's a great example of, and when we talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect, of this guy who goes in to try to rob a bank. And what he does is he uses invisible ink on his face and then goes in and robs the bank. And then they catch him. And he's like, what did happen? How did you, well, we caught you on the video camera. But how? I had invisible ink on my face. And it was just like, everyone's like, okay. The idea is the person doesn't have the faculties or awareness to realize their own ignorance, right? So that's what the Dunning-Kruger effect is that we don't have we don't have enough of the facilities to realize our own ignorance in that regard. Now, the third person effect is a little different. It's related in an extent, but it's a little different because it has much more to do with perception of self and other versus just the lack of faculties in that regards to understand, oh, I'm just, I just don't understand that that's not how it works, is not having that. So there's the perception aspect of it, but I do see how you can see that it's similar. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is fascinating because it also says something about expertise too. Often those with Dunning-Kruger, like who tend to succumb to Dunning-Kruger, also have more confidence in their expertise. But you'll notice people who are actual experts, well, actually, most of you will probably know this, that when you start encountering information for the first time, your confidence might be really high, where you're like, oh, this is so amazing, I'm getting it. And I know when I was younger, I was like that. I was like, oh, this is so amazing. I get it now. I know, I understand, I get it. And then your confidence is really high. And then you start encountering more information. And then you're like, oh, I don't know a lot. And then you encounter more and more, and you're like, oh, I really don't know anything. And you're like, there's so much more for me to know and learn about. Oh my gosh. And you start getting, in many ways, that humility and humbleness kind of keeps you in check to realize there's a lot I just don't know. And I should keep that in mind as I keep going. But the Dunning-Kruger effect tends to have that kind of where you're like, oh, no, I'm confident. I should be able to rob this bank with invisible ink and I'll be fine. And that can be also a hindrance to one's ability to see that. So that can be how it's similar, because that overconfidence can make someone not realize their own deficits in that regards. Yeah,
Now,
that's a good question.
yeah, very interesting concepts there. You touched upon expertise, and that kind of leads into another question that came in.
Yeah.
So earlier in your presentation, you kind of mentioned that the retraction of scholarly articles in academia is pretty typical for the general public who may not be as aware of that. Is it possible that the retraction of those articles, in a sense, might kind of taint the expertise of scholars to them,
Okay.
perhaps
Oh
lead them
yeah.
to reject, expert claims in the future?
Oh, this is a great question. Absolutely, and it's still a hot topic in psychology, especially social psychology. And social psychology, there's often we've gone through what's called the replication crisis. So in social psychology, we try to be very humble in a lot of the claims that are being made, because a lot of social psychology is evocative. A lot of people find it really interesting, and some will start making claims that are little overstatements of what's happening in an actual study. So we really emphasize replication in the studies that we find. And we also try to teach really kind of scientific consumption, or critical scientific consumption of information, meaning that when it comes to scientific literacy, one must realize that science is constantly updating itself, and that, hey, just because you found it in one study doesn't mean you're going to find it in other studies. And so you really want to make sure, okay, you found something great. Can you replicate that about 5 or 6 times before I'm going to have any kind of real confidence? And that's really, really important in the sciences. And for many of those who consume that kind of regularly, know that to some extent. That being said, in every science, we're all human, no matter what science. There's not like one discipline that's like, oh, these are all the good people, although sometimes philosophers might think that. But actually, I always think that's kind of funny, because with philosophers, it turns out that the books that are most stolen from the library are the ethics books, which I always think that's funny. In some, there's a certain there's a certain kind of issue that I found that one study that would be fascinating. But there's not like one group that's all right and all correct. And that can definitely impact the confidence one can have in those types of studies. Absolutely. And that can be an issue. Absolutely. Sure. I can definitely say that. That being said, it's not that you should throw the baby out with the bathwater type of thing. It's not like we should all of a sudden go, okay, because we have a few scientists who do this, that we should never adhere to any type of scientific knowledge, or looking at that. The idea is that as we get more and more at producing good quality scientific information, we'll be able to weed out those false and unethical studies quicker, and able to go, oh, yeah, that's an issue, and that retraction is part of it. Yeah. Yeah. And then also do consider, although retraction is something common in that we see in academia, it's not actually uncommon to in other areas. It's just less focused on, or less, in some ways, less acknowledged. But if you've read any book or textbook, you'll find misspellings. You'll find things that are wrong in them. It's not, you'll find erratums, like that's part of it, where people are correcting the errors in their books. It's just part of it, it's part of any type of knowledge creation. That means I don't want to downplay. It's not good to lie. So I want to emphasize that. Don't lie. Don't make up don't make up information. Don't be unethical. Be the best you can, but just recognize, be critical, that not everyone is going to adhere to those standards either, or sometimes inadvertently not adhere to those standards.